Hey guys, happy Friday. I'm just hitting my buttons here. Um, well, welcome to our fun Friday class, our Friday beading class, and it's good to see you guys. I missed you this week. Today we have a really cool for summer ready gemstone bracelet with a matching pair of earrings. So it's like a set that we can just create really fast. And I think that it's one of those techniques, like so many of these bead weaving techniques, that can become a lot of things. So like, for example, this stitch can be done with different size beads. You're not stuck using rondelles. I used rondelles because I had a nice strand I wanted to use, but it could work with a 6mm round. It could work with a bicone crystal. It could work with anything you've got, right? And then you can also incorporate different colors of seed beads and accent beads. So I'm using a lot of crystal today because crystal, I love crystal, but you can use other beads in place of the crystal. You can use little 4mm accents in gemstone, for example, which hit beads. The sky is the limit. So once you get the technique, dialed in, you can take that and just next level it for so many things. I know a lot of you guys out there are already thinking necklace. Yes, totally, anklets, all that stuff. So on the mat, what I have going on is quite a lot of supplies for this one, but the kind of supplies I'm using are the ones that you get a lot and you can use them for many different, projects as you go along. So I'm just going to switch really quick so you can see what I've got on my mat here. And so the first thing I was thinking we would do is, so we can let it dry and work while we're doing that, is I was going to create this little gemstone drop. And so how this is made is I started with these beautiful rondelles. These are the same ones we're using in the bracelet. And there's a new finding, new to me. It's not new, in general, but I had never really used these very much before. And what they are is just a glue and end peg. And I've seen them and not really understood, like, hey, what's that? I thought pearls usually, but why not use it with a gemstone? And this actually came out and looked very, very cool. I mean, it's just the way it gives you these dimensions to work in. So I used that as a charm on the bracelet. I also used it on the earrings. And here's the earrings. These are just a nice, simple looped on an eye pin with that as the focal dangle. So I was thinking I'll introduce all the supplies just real quick, and then we'll maybe do a deeper introduction on each supply as we use them, because there's so many, right? It's a lot to take in, but in general, we're going to be using that gemstone strand. I'm using some crystals, and we've got a bunch of findings that I'm going to just, as we're using them, bring them in. And as always, all of the stuff that I've got out on the mat today is summarized in the handout, so you'll be able to find it. And those SKUs that are in there are the Michaels app SKUs. So you just type in that number, product should come up, and you can add it to cart. We're using some seed beads. We're using all 3 sizes today. We've got some smalls, some size 10 check. I'm using some size 8 check and some size 6 check. I'm using some Wildfire leader. And we're going to use some, as I mentioned earlier, the earrings have a little bit of wire working, not too much. We're just going to use some round nose pliers, some chain nose pliers, and some flush cutters. All right, and then lots of little findings. As I was saying, there's a bunch, but we'll just introduce them as we go. Let's start with these. Okay, so these little pegs are the ones we're going to glue, and I have some tricks that I have come up with, just kind of playing with them on my own that I think work really well that I wanted to share. So let's get our gemstone out and select for the ones you'd like to be your earring if you want them to match. A lot of variation is present on this gemstone strand. So what I did is I kind of selected for the ones I thought will look good together. So maybe these 2. And actually I'm thinking those 2. Okay. All right. And then what I have here, this is just the back of a sticker label. It actually came from my thermal printer. And I'm just going to use this as my glue surface so I don't have glue dripping on my nice mat. I'm using a jewelry and metal glue for this today. There's lots of adhesives that'll work. This is the one that I picked up. And again, it's in the handout highlighted there. And a lot of the times with glues, everybody kind of has their favorite, and more than one type is going to work. So this is one that I've tried that I know for sure does. And so what I did is I just kind of held it in my hand and I made a little dot of glue on the card, because it comes out really fast and I wanted to be able to control how much glue. And if you're having trouble holding it, you can use your chain nose pliers to hold the loop. but I'm basically just kind of running the peg in the glue just to get a nice amount of glue on there. So I just went, you know, straight down. I know it's hard to see at this angle, but I was going, pretend this is the paper. I was just kind of doing circles straight down in the glue like that. And then I'll bring my gemstone over. Let's get right in there. And now we're just going to use gravity to help us out. So it's just going to sit right there on the top. This is a pretty fast drying glue, but the cure time is a little longer. So I'm going to, when we do our demo, I'm going to use one that I pre-glued. But what you'll want to do once you've got one of these ready is just set it kind of somewhere where it can stay flat. For me, I think the best place to put it might be back here behind me on my table, just so it doesn't get knocked with all my thread that we're about to get out. And so same thing here, and it'll continue to drip until you put the lid back on it. Just doing a circle. Get my gemstone. And I'll drop in there. And there we go. It's that easy. A little wobbly at first, but it will firm up really quick. All right, so I'm going to set this one, just set it right behind me. And I'm going to get the cat back on my glue. And that out of the way. All right, so next up, let's start the bracelet. We're going to need to cut about 80 inches of thread. And that's if you want to make one that has 10 repeats. So this has 10 gemstones on it. But you can always do something different. Like, for example, you can make it longer or shorter, depending on what you want. The measure on this with 10 repeats and the wire guardian and the clasp that I'm using is 7 inches exactly. And it'll do this waviness while you wear it. That's part of the look. So you don't want to try to stretch it and measure it, and just measure it just flat and, you know, laying as it normally would. You'll get about a 7-inch bracelet. So here comes my 80 inches. And I'm going to trim that. Actually, I'm going to use my scissors that I always use. There we go. And then I'm going to get some chain nose pliers. A lot of you guys have seen this, but I always show it. I show it every time because this is the life-saving needle threading trick. But you'll need some chain nose pliers, or square nose in the case of what I've got here. And then just flatten the end. And it should get paper thin. And then just pinch it between your fingers. Get your needle. I'm using a size 10 beading needle today. And it should go right through. If it doesn't, flatten it again. And mine's not doing it. I think my cut was not very clean when I was using the flush cutters. Let's try that again. There we go. So it takes a minute. Just give yourself some grace and some patience. Threading the needles can sometimes be a challenge. If it's really not working for you, switch your needle, try a different needle. But definitely flattening it, that's the ticket. If it is too flat, one of the things I came up with the other day is like, I was really going to town flattening it. It was too flat, which makes it bendy when you push on it. If you're getting something like that, mine was just starting to do that, go ahead and trim it and reflatten and try again. The trick is kind of a Goldilocks of not overdoing it and just getting it just right, so that it stays a little bit strong, but is flat enough to easily go through the eye of the needle. There are also those open eye needles that they sell, and those, you know, those could work. They're the hard ones. Don't get the soft braided one, but the hard needle that has where you can pull it open in the center. I've seen some folks use that for bead weaving, and it actually does work. So it's another option. Okay, so the seed beads. We're gonna need, I'm shoving a bunch of beads here out of the way really quick. I'm gonna get some of my gemstones out, and I won't need the crystals right away, but I'm gonna definitely need gemstones and seed beads first. So let's start with our size 10. This is hematite. So I got those. And I've got some size 8 silver lined gold. And then I've got the Hawaii mix of size 6 check, and I'm going to select the hematite out of this mix as we work. You don't have to sort it, just dump it out. And as you pick up beads, just pick up the hematite ones. All right. So the first thing you're going to want to do is put on a stop bead. So if stop beads are a new concept to you, just stick with me for just a second. But you'll just pick up one of the smaller beads. This is the size 10. Bring it down to the bottom and leave a tail that's about 10 to 12 inches. I think in the handout we said 10-inch tail. Yeah, so about 10 to 12 inches. This is going to be needed to put your wire guard in on the side. So you want to leave yourself something to work with there. And then just take your needle and go back through that same bead. And when you do that, you'll get a little stop bead. So you see it's going to loop like that. I'm just going to pull tight. And there's our loop. And that's just going to keep our beads from falling off the end. Okay, so let's start the pattern. Again, you don't have to memorize anything I'm showing you today. It's all here. But what we're going to do first is just create the first layer. This has 3 layers, right? So we're going to create layer 1. We've already got our size 10 on there. We're going to go on and add an 8, a size 6, a rondelle, and just repeat that for the length we're going for. If you're going for 7 inches, do that 10 times, and then just adjust from there. So here's this one. And here's one of my rondelles. Grab another size 6 bead. And a size 10. So we're just going to keep going up and down, up and down. So there's 2 repeats. And this by itself is gorgeous. I mean, if you just did this by itself, it would be beautiful, just like that. So going back to 8. Here's our 6s. Gemstone. And a 10. And I think for my sample today, I'm just going to go to about 7 beads just for some brevity. But of course, any length that you'd like to make yours is going to work. Grab a few more of these. There's 5, and we'll do 2 more. All right, and I'm going to repeat one more time. Here's one more of these. All right, so we've reached the end here. I strung 2 of the size 10 instead of 1. So when I got to the lot, we've been doing 1 size 10 and then repeating it. But I've got 2 on mine because what I'm trying to do is we're going to add our wire guardian. So here's 2 size 10 beads. That's what I ended with. And again, to see that a little clearer, what we did is we strung this repeative pattern. And now I'm right here, and what I've got on so far are these 2, just those 2. So let's get our wire guardian. We'll come around, we'll add 2 more, and then we'll head back this way. The wire guardians I'm using, and as I introduce each finding, or as I'm using, I'll introduce the packaging. So they look like this. These are all on the findings wall. They're the 18-karat gold-plated wire guardians. So this is a really, a leveled up design as far as just the sparkle and the gold and all the quality there. And I have my wire guardian ready in here. least I thought I did. Oh, I have it right there. There we go. This one is earrings ready. Okay, here's my wire guardian. So wire guardians, anyone new to wire guardians, what they are, they have two holes at the bottom. And that hole is a tube, a metal tube that goes about, halfway up the finding. And then when you flip it, you notice this part is open right here. This is what's called the well. The thread's going to sit right inside there. And then you come back down and you go through the tube on the other side and then stitch on from there. And we always reinforce these when we add them. They have a lot of practical applications outside of bead weaving as well. A lot of people use them for their beading wire. And you see them a lot on fringe earrings, which we've done here in a couple classes. So I went around and I went through the other side here, but I have a trick now for keeping the thread in the well that I want to share. So if you just kind of pinch it now in between your thumb and your finger and pull, it should keep that thread in the well for you. See it staying in there, and then just hold it and pull down and tighten it up. So you want to just get it as close as you can to where you're working. Let's get two more size 10 check beads. Two of these. And we're going to head back now down through the size 8 seed bead. So we're going through this one here, which is our gold bead here. And after you get through your gold bead, go ahead and continue on through the size 6 seed bead, go through the rondelle, and go through the size 6 seed bead. And so we will be back this way on the third pass, and that's when I'll reinforce this wire guardian connection. For now, I'm just getting it on there, but it is not reinforced yet. So not super strong just yet, but it's there. Okay. So layer 2. Layer 2 is really easy. We're going to pick up a size 10 check seed bead and a size 8 check seed bead. And we're going to add that to the center of every 6-0 all the way back down. And then we're going to add that wire guardian on the other side, the same way we did it here on this first side. So let's just breeze through that really quick. Got our 10-0, 8-0, and 10-0. We're going to skip the 8-0, 10-0, 8-0 and go through the next 6-0, continue through the rondelle, and the next 6-0 bead. So you want to get through all three of those. And what'll happen is it'll just kind of sit side by side like that. So we're doing a lot of things right now. We're making it stronger, the bracelet stronger. We're making it pretty, and we're getting where we need to be, which is back over here to put on our other side. So again, I'm skipping the 8-0 and the 10-0 and the 8-0, and I'm going through the 6-0, the rondelle, and the 6-0 to add another little section there. So let's go straight down through these. Some more. Just going through those three, sorry. Pull tight. And so the counts and the beads that I'm using, these are all just one idea, right? You can do different things. You don't have to stick with 3 either. You can make these little intermissions between the rondelles longer. You can put different beads on them. But just the concept itself can be done so many ways. And literally with any beads you have handy that you want to use up. All right, and so I'm at the last one. And so I've gone through the 3 we've been going through, which are the size 6 and the gemstone and the 6. But now I'm going to go ahead and continue through the 8-0 as well, because I'm at the end. So go through that 8-0. Pull that thread through. Take a look, make sure everything's right. It's hard to fix later if we missed something, but just make sure it's looking good to you. The good news is if you've missed a bead, like say you didn't pick one up, it would be very apparent right now. It would cause kind of like a little sway or a little a wave that you would see. So it's looking good. Okay, so what we've got right now is our working thread exiting from that 8 seed bead, and we've got a stop bead on a tail over here. Let's pull off the stop bead. And to do that, just pinch it under your thumbnail and just pull. And it'll just come right off. And let's do the same thing we did on the other side with the wire guardian. So we've got 2 size 10 check beads here and a wire guardian. And again, we're going to just go through the tube on one side. And then I just carry on and go through the tube on the other side. And then pinch it. Just pull straight down until you meet the work. That's there. Let's get 2 more size 10 seed beads. There we go. Back through the 8. All right. And once you've gone through the 8 seed bead, go ahead and continue on through the 6, the gemstone, and the 6. Got all that in one swoop if you can. Our goal is to get out through that 6 that's on the other side. And so what we have going on, what we left behind there, is a unreinforced connection with our wire guardian. But we have our tail thread here. This tail thread later is going to be able to reinforce it the same way we're going to head back over here and reinforce this one. So that's what we're doing there.
Danielle, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
Would you say that the peacock steel is similar to hematite?
It's the same color. I've been misnomering it because whenever I call it peacock steel, people are like, what's that? It's hematite. It's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I should have called it what it was named. Sorry about that. But it just throws people off because it's kind of like almost the same as that one there. That's the one that's in the Hawaii mix. All right, and so we're exiting here from the 6 seed bead there. And I wanted to point out one more thing. You might notice that it's loose, right? See how loose that is? You can kind of, that's because we're right here next to the tail. And when you pull on the tail thread, that all tightens up. So don't get thrown off by that. It's okay. Because we have not woven this in yet. It's still loose. And now we get to embellish. Okay, so what I did to embellish it, again, this is just totally just style, right? You can do this any way you like, but I'm just adding a size 10 check seed bead, and this is a 4mm crystal round. And this is where you can improvise and use other stuff if you want to. Size 10 check seed bead, and we're doing that same thing where we're skipping over all of the beads that we have here in the middle and just going through the 6 O's. We're just traveling through, just like that. So I'm going to grab, and also what I did, again, just style, I grabbed a bunch of different colors here. So I have a different finish on these 2 crystals. One's AB and one's not. I actually just used what I had, but what's in the handout, if you look at the handout, are these 2 colors here, the crystal and the topaz. All right, and so I'm just going to pick up a size 10 seed bead, go through my crystal. And what I did also is I alternated the color every other ore. So you can do that if you like it, or do something different if you want to. There's those 3. Let's go through the 6 gemstone and 6 And what'll happen is it'll just sit there in a little bundle. So we've got a super strong bracelet going on here now. 3 passes through. And just a really cool look. And I'm going to switch to my crystal now. Same size, just different colors. There we go. That's so pretty. I love creating these. I do a lot of this type of stitching for a lot of different types of beads. And every time you get a completely amazing different look. And it's really hard to tell it apart from the former ones that you made because they all are going to look completely different, but the process is identical to get there. And it kind of, in a way, looks like a rope stitch, right? It's like a way that you can fake a rope stitch if you wanted to have that look, but didn't want to go through all that process of doing a round stitch. Here's those. So jump over and go through the next one here. Chasing crystals off the camera here. There we go. Okay. Here's the next one here. Last but not least, I'm going to end with a clear crystal just based on where I am in my counts. All right, so here's the last ad. And I'm doing the same thing where we're going through the 6/0, the gemstone and the 6/0, but go ahead and continue through your 8/0. It'll probably naturally, that'll just happen for you as you're stitching. Pull through. And in general, there's the bracelet. And that wave you're seeing, it's not, it's a faux wave, right? It's an optical illusion because this is actually staying pretty straight. It's just that the way that those crystals jet out make it look wavy, which I thought was a cool look. And let's reinforce. Okay, so and this is really the last part of the bracelet to show you, but because we did all this stuff here, this gives us places to turn. Now it's really handy because now we can make our passes back up through this and through this, and it gives us somewhere to weave in. So I'm going to do that with my working side by going through the 10/0 check here and right up through the wire guardian. Keep going through that, jumping over. And you'll probably only be able to get through the 2 seed beads at first because there's some asymmetry going there. And again, I'm pinching here to keep the thread on the well. Looks good. Let's head back through the 8. And I'm going to continue through the gemstone, the 6/0. From here, pick a path, any path. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You can go through your original, set of 10/0 and 8/0, or the 8/0. I think I'm going to go through here because this is where my thread's sitting. But just pick one of those. So I chose the one that has the 10/0, the 8/0, the 10/0. And now I'm going to turn and come back through an adjacent one. So let's go through the crystals pass here. Just making a turn there. And head back up through the 6/0, the gemstone, 6/0, and the 8/0. Go around that wire guardian one more time. And this is probably going to start to get tight for you. It's actually not doing bad for me though. Sometimes wire guardians can get a little tight on the 3rd pass. Don't sweat it. Also, don't force it. If you're getting a spot where your needle's not going through, pull the needle back out and reposition because that is a sign you're puncturing thread. If it's not letting you go through with some minimal pressure, right? There we go. All right, so that wire guardian is solid. So how would you go about weaving in? Same thing. We'll just go through the ones we didn't go through before. I neglected this one when I did my turn earlier, so I'm going to choose that one now, which is the 8/0, 10, 8/0. And then just continue down. So in the next section here, I'm exiting from the 6/0. And let's just do another turn. So this time I chose to go through the crystal segment, turn back and go through my 10/0, 8/0, 10/0 segment there. And now let's make another turn and head down through the one we didn't use yet. And so you can do that one more time. And it would be very solidly woven in. Just do that really quick. Again, just through one section. Back up through the adjacent one. Just go through whatever one is closest. And then down through the one you didn't use yet. And then from there, go ahead and go through your gemstone, 6-0, all that, and go ahead and trim it. So to trim, what I do is I take my scissors and I push down on the beads and pull up on the strand and then cut. And then it'll hide pretty well in there. You'd want to repeat everything I just did on this side with your tail thread on this side. So you trip up through the wire guardian, down, make a turn, get back up there, reinforce that one more time, then come down here, weave in, and trim. And that's the bracelet in a nutshell. From here, you'd want to put some findings on it. And so on the original design, I used a toggle. And that toggle clasp is in the handout. And you could also put chain in a lobster claw. I thought I'd show that today. So in case anyone wants to try to do that, there's lots of chain at Michael's you can grab. I liked the toggle, but then if you're selling your work, it could be handy to see putting on an adjustable chain. So I found this at the, what's it called? The bindings wall, kind of right next to where you would find the 18-karat gold bindings. I've been using this. It's lasted me a long time. We've used it in a few projects. Also, it's going to be used in a project we're doing 2 weeks from now. So if you want to grab this chain for that class, and it'll also work for today's. If you don't already have the toggle and also if you're trying to make it adjustable. So I have here a lobster claw. And a lobster claw is in the same packaging. You'll find it right next to these. So lobster claw version. And then you'll need some jump rings. So I'm using some 6mm jump rings today. They have the sizes on the back. If you're looking for those sizes, you could use 5mm too, and that would work fine. 8mm might look a little big, but it would probably work fine. And let's see. So I'm going to put on the lobster claw first. You're going to need some chainless pliers. I have a trick I like to do for my jump ringing that I always like to share in case anyone likes it too. A lot of times when you buy wire tools, you'll get what looks like this, it's a bent nose, right? This is really cool for jump rings, in my opinion. And then you'll often be given in one of those little sets a pair of regular chain nose, and they'll come with a square chain nose. I love these for jump rings. They're very cool for jump rings because they really hold the jump ring firm while you're looking for getting the other side open. So opening jump rings, in case anyone's new to that, I'm just going to go a little slow through it. All jump rings have a seam, and you can find the seam usually because it'll be a little separated like that. And if it's really closed, you can find it by feeling. It'll have a little bumpy kind of like edge you can feel for. And I'll take my square nose and I'll hold one side of the jump ring with the seam facing away from me. Seams right here on the top. And then take those bent nose pliers and open that up. And the motion I used was lateral. I was doing this so that you don't want to ever pull your jump ring apart. You want to just preserve that circle. So we're going to get that hooked on there. Here's a lobster claw. If this was your toggle, you just put the toggle on just the same way. And then bring those bent nose pliers back over. Secure the side like this. Close it in that same lateral motion that we were using before. And you can wiggle, every time you wiggle this, you're doing what's called work hardening the wire. And these are already pretty hard, but it helps to put what I feel like it's kind of like a spring action pressure that you're putting on that seam when you wiggle it back and forth like I was doing. So it really, really locks that in. See? So there's our lobster claw. We would do the same thing on this side with our chain. Ignore my tail thread just for a minute. But what I would do is I would cut about 1 inch of chain. Let's measure that out. 1 to 1.5 inches. Let's cut here so we have 1.5 inches. These are flush cutters. These are what I use to cut any kind of wire or head pins, eye pins, that kind of thing. And what you'll want to do is get another jump ring. Also, if you wanted to, if you remembered in the moment when you were stitching on your wire guardian, and I actually meant to do this, but then it slipped my mind when I was at that spot, but you can put that directly onto that wire guardian at the time you're stitching it. And then it saves you doing a jump ring. If you forgot, like me, just grab a jump ring and you can attach it there. Again, here's my square nose. And let's open it up, lateral motion here. That connected there. All right. And so optionally, we can stick some charms on the end of our bracelet. And I will show that coming up here in just a second. But we've also got our earrings to make. So far, there's our bracelet. It's completely ready, except for that weaving in that I've got to do. It's really tiny. I'm actually going to give this to a friend of mine's niece. So it's a little girl one. So this one, it doesn't have its charms yet. We're going to put this on in just a sec. Let's check on what we made a minute ago, our glue. So we've got these here. And we've got the one I made earlier hanging out somewhere here. And so I'm going to grab a few more jump rings. I'm going to grab 2. Just in case I want to put another crystal on my bracelet. Here's one more quick jump ring. And I like to put my charms, when it comes to bracelets, I like to put them on the side of my chain. So I'll just go ahead and pop this onto the wire guardian that's on my chain side. And if this was a toggle, I would put it on my ring side. Toggle ring side. I'll bring back the original and show you guys that. There's that. Here's the original. And you see on the toggle ring side, it's got the crystal. And this is just a crystal on a head pin. We're about to do some wire over here. I'll show you how we did that. And then there's our charm glued on there. All right, so earrings. All right, so we're gonna need ear wires, and we're going to need some eye pins. These eye pins are 1.5 inch eye pin. And again, these are the 18 karat gold. And then these are just some nice, really nice plated fish hook ear wires. So all my findings today are really matchy and like really nice next to each other. And so, it's kind of like up to you what you like. Let me show you my sample again. What I did and I thought looked cool was I just highlighted a gemstone in the middle by surrounding it with a repeat of our pattern from the bracelet. So 10, 8, 6, and back down. And then I did a simple loop and I put the charm on the bottom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch to so I'm using my square here. I'm going to switch now to my other chain nose pliers, which are much pointier. And those are actually my round nose. Sorry. Here they are. These are my chain nose. And in case anyone does what I just did, this is a round nose plier. You can tell because it doesn't have a flat inside, but this one is flat inside. So compare that to your square nose. You can see the difference, but they're both flat on the inside. And so I'm going to open up this eye. So kind of like we did with the jump ring. These come with an eye already formed at the bottom, or a loop. And it has a seam. Find your seam. If your seam is like right there, you can usually get your fingernail through it. We're going to laterally open that just like a jump ring. Just open that up. And then we're going to pop on. These aren't glued as much as I wish they were cured, but we're just going to take a chance. I would normally let them cure a little longer. And then just laterally close that loop until it's flush like that. All right, and so let's get a size 10 seed bead, an 8. Let's get a size 6 seed bead. I'm going to need a few more for selecting my hematites out of there. And we're going to need a jump. Let's see. Let's look for something matchy here, but not too matchy. That one or those two look pretty good. All right, put on here. Another 6-0, 8-0, and a 10-0. All right, so we're going to form what's called a simple loop. And I have a couple things I like to do when I'm doing a simple loop. I take a look at where the eye is positioned. So this is the eye is this loop here at the bottom. And I'll point it kind of parallel with the direction I'm about to bend this wire. So it's just from where I'm sitting, it's pointing towards me, kind of like perpendicular to me. And then get your smallest pliers. So you can use the teeny round nose, or you can use some chain nose. I'm just going to grab, these are my round nose, and I'm just going to hold as close as I can to the top of that seed bead right there. Just hold it right there and bend your wire forward 90 degrees. Or you can even go a little further than 90. You can go all the way down if you want, but at least 90 degrees. I realized I think I go a little more than that. All right, so take off the pliers, set that down for a second. Let's get our measures out. We want to make the part that's sticking out right here, this part, we want to make that part a 1/4 inch. So like that much. That's going to form the exact loop we want to kind of match what's going on down here with this eye. So let's just take this and we'll measure from here down. And it looks like I want to cut right about there. So take your flush cutters, and flush cutters have a side that is flat and a side that's open. Point that flat side towards your beads on that wire because you want the flush side to be the one that you end up with. And again, just checking that I got that 1/4 inch there. And trim. And that's what we're going for. So let's get our round nose. Work toward the end of your pliers, but not too far toward the end. So kind of like right about there. Take a look at yours. All around those pliers are a little bit different. Some of them have a really big hoop, some are smaller. If you have bail making pliers, you can use those with the smallest setting. That'll work too. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this forward. So we're going to just roll it until we just make a circle with this. I'm going to try to do that facing up here so you can see it. All right. So we're just going to roll. I'm rolling away from myself. See, we're making a circle all the way down as far as you can get. And then you can help it with chain nose pliers. Grab those. You can help close it a little bit. And you'll get a little loop like that. So that's what we're going for. Another thing you can do that's a kind of a nice to have is you can take your chain nose pliers on one side and pinch to hold that firm. You can take your square nose and you can make those face the same direction, just kind of by twisting it. Another handy thing is you can use the security of having that held here to maybe get this closed a little more. And if you have what's like, kind of looks like an open there, I do have another trick to share for closing those. But you can hold on to your work, just hold it really securely and just try to kind of pinch it from, you're putting pressure here and here. And just kind of get that to close. Be really gentle so you don't mar it. There we go. It's pretty good. All right, let's get an ear wire. Ear wire's ready. And we will find the seam. On these ear wires, you can move the ball up and you can see pretty clearly where your seam is. Just get those tiny chain nose here. Open that up in that same lateral motion that we used for the jump ring. I'm gonna put that loop we just made there on there. I'll just close that up. There you go. So we're doing pretty good on time. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just check in with Carmi and see what you guys would like to see again. We did one earring, we did the bracelet. I could show putting the crystal charm and a different kind of wire wrap on the bracelet. That's one thing we could do.
Danielle, you read my mind. I've been watching the clock because not everybody found the bail. So that they're not disappointed and can still make the charm. Why don't you do your regular way of doing it?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Let me show that really quick. And in that case, you can use either an eye pin or a head pin, so whichever one you like. We do have in the same line where these are located, we have some that instead of a loop at the bottom is just a flat end. And I don't think I put them on the handout because they were optional, but see how the end of that is flat. So you can use that, or you can just have the little wire loop show, which is absolutely fine. It looks great. So I'm going to grab a I'm going to grab a crystal. Let's get a crystal out of here. And put that crystal on. Bring that down. Now, if you were using this as your earring bottom, for example, in place of this, you could put the gemstone on there. So we'll do a gemstone one after this. Here's my round nose. These are my round nose pliers. Got this gemstone on there, and I'm going to do a different kind of loop here. We're going to do a wrap loop, just to show you something different. So when I do my wrap loops, what I like to do is, again, I'll put the pliers here. I'll bend it forward, but this time I really do stay at the 90-degree mark. And then rotate your round nose pliers up. Don't worry, I'm going to do this twice, but rotate those up so they're like that. And then slide it down so the loop's a little bigger. Slide it down on the tool. Bring this up and around. Let's go up and around. Crossover. You'll reach a point right here where you can't go any further, but you know you want to cross this one over this one. Just rotate those pliers one more time, and you'll be able to make a full circle. So what we're going for is a full circle where that crosses itself. Then I like to switch to my chain nose and hold that loop in place. And then I'll take, if it's something I can bend with my hands, then depending on the temper of the wire, the temper on this is going to be medium hard. So this is a pretty strong bend here. I'm going to use some assist from one of my other pliers to make that turn. If you were using like a medium soft, it would be a little easier to do. But I'm going to just use this to turn. Got one. Round. And I'm going to go ahead and do 3 wraps. Sometimes you can get 2, sometimes you can get 3. It depends how much air you gave yourself when you did the first bend. But there's a wrapped loop. We need to trim the other side. We need to trim that tail there. So get your flush cutters, get in as close as you can. And be really careful here. This is the spot where things go flying. I like to put my hand over it. Well, sometimes what I do actually is I'll pinch it with these 2 fingers. See, this is the thing I'm about to cut off. I'm gonna hold it like that because these do go flying. And if you have pets, guys, like it's not good to have these on the ground. So just try to catch them and save them. But there you go. So there's a wrap loop. Let's put our pliers to the work here and just flatten down that little, and you can see where it's kind of poking up a little bit. We're just going to flatten that down. And there you go. So what I would do with that is I would grab my square nose and get another jump ring. Let's see. And then I would get my bent nose, open that up. That pretty side right there. And put that on the chain side with my other little charm. I'm just going right onto the wire guardian. Again, I'm doing that wiggle. See the wiggle here? Giving it a spring action strength. It stays right on there. And ignoring that little strand, which I'll weave in later, it is finished. You could also, if you wanted to, sometimes with chain, it's really cool to put a weight at the bottom of your chain. It makes it easier for you to put on your jewelry. So you could take another one of these and do another little wrap. Something I like to do, since we've got a few seconds here, I'm going to show you something that I love. I really love to just do 3 seed beads and have that be, and if this was a head pin, it would look even cooler. But they both work and they're both great. And then just go ahead and do either a simple or a wrapped loop. I'll do another wrapped loop. Up. And that up. Slide that down a little bit. Bring that around to the point where I can't go anymore. Move those pliers 45 degrees and finish that turn. So there's our turn. Chain nose plier is going to hold that loop in place. And here's my square nose again. Give this a loop around. Let's keep going. All right. And that time I only got 2. See, I was a little tighter with my connection there. Let's get my flush cutters. Again, you always want to cut with the flush side toward where you're cutting so that that stays the, and I'll show you actually, let me cut that and show you what it looks like on the cut side. Again, I'm going to hold these like that, right? So they don't go flying. And the side that I cut, do you see how it's got a triangle shape? It's a little hard to see on without magnification, but it's not completely flush. It is on the side that I cut facing that way. It's just something to think about. It's still going to work even if you don't do that, but it's just a nice to have. And holding these. Actually, I want to do that with these. These are the larger, the square nose. I'll hold that in place and get my chain nose pliers over here. And be really careful with the seed bead. Be really gentle with it. I've broken seed beads before this way, but there we go. Make sure they can still spin. And that is a really cool charm for the end of your chain. I love putting these on chain ends. So you could either jump ring it, or one cool thing I could do is I could open up this side of the eye pin and hook it that way. So there you go. That chain might be a little long for what I need it for. So I might reduce the length of that later. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell. So you could do the same kind of thing, but with a gemstone, if you were trying to do that bottom without one of these old glue-in pegs. You just do one of those same loops, either wrapped or simple, whichever one you liked the most. And that would take the place of that.
Danielle, thank you. And thank you for showing an alternate way of adding a bead charm, because not everyone were able to get all the supplies, so they can do something else in the meantime.
Okay.
Eve would love to know what you're wearing. Particularly that bracelet has been flying by the screen.
Oh yes, this is a class coming up in May. And so what this is here, let me take it off and show you. It is have you guys ever done a flat spiral rope? I think we did a flat spiral rope together. But it was really, okay, it was our first class ever that we did. Now it's coming back to me. The very, very first class we ever did for Michael's was a flat spiral that was just one column, right? So I was like, hey, let's do 2 columns. And this class has ended up being not super far off from the date of that first class. It's almost like the flat spiral anniversary or something. I don't have I have the handout in front of me, but the handout's already available. You can already go and download it at michaels.com/classes. And you guys, this one's going to be fun. I won't use these colors. I really wanted to use the pearl with, this is the agate mix with white pearl. And it's white pearl in a size either 10 or 11, I can't remember, and then a size 8. And then I just like ombre it. That's the cool thing about a mix, is you can ombre. Any of these mixes will work. There's tons of 6.0 mixes that we have, both on the Michaels wall and online. So try that out. You guys will love this. That's not our next class, but it is next month. And it is actually, this is our last April class, so we're already into May, right? How that happened? Oh my God. Next week, I believe next week we're doing the earrings party. I meant to just double check my dates before, but I have this to show you and I can show you the designs. So we're going to do 3 super fast, like date night ready earrings in a jiffy in that class. So we called it earrings in 5 minutes because they're speedy. I have them here to show you. These are trending really big right now. The shoulder duster with pearl. I saw a pair of these in a department store and they were pricey. So, I mean, this is like a trend that you can DIY yourself and make it look so cool. And then threaders. I heard threaders were super on trend. But I don't really like to wear threaders. They're kind of hard to put on, right? So I took a post earring and then I just did a jump ring to the back of the post. And then our post earrings findings have a loop on the front. So you just attach. And you can dangle whatever you want from it. I've been wearing these a lot. I use just some regular crystal. And last but not least, there's these. Michael sells a finding that's a loop. And I'll show you how to finish it and do the little hook here. And all I did is put crystal and chain and a little graduated. You can do this in any color. And they sell these in silver and gold and in different sizes. The pack comes like with a bunch of sizes. So that's our earrings party. And then we're going to do a poppy bracelet. I called it poppy because of the bright reddy orange color. But this one is really fun. Just unhook it really quick. So it's a cluster design that we're going to do a bunch of wire here. We've got chip beads and gemstone beads. The cool thing about the gemstones I've used here is they're all from one strand. And you can use the ones that I used, or you can go and find other gemstones and they sell the same sizes in that 4-pack. The 4-pack has a 4mm bead, a chip bead, and then it has a 6mm and an 8mm bead all in one. I found one in rhodonite. I found some sodalite, just to name a few. And the one that you see here is red quartzite. So it's like a dyed quartz. Super cool. You want to bring some wire, bell linking pliers, all of that. That's all right here. And you can download this right now on the website. And yeah, and then I think after that we've got, we're going right into this one. Yep, that's this one then. And then we've got an odd count herringbone. This was a special request from some of our students. It's a little bit of an advanced bead weaving technique, but I promise it's approachable. It's not gonna be too scary. And then I just decided to play with some color blocking there. So that's all of May. We do have June submitted. I don't know if it's up yet. I meant to check this morning and then got super busy, but I think June will be online maybe like in a day or two, on Monday or something, if it's not already there. And for June, we're doing, so far what I've got submitted is a color theory, where we're gonna make our own seed bead mix. And then talk a little bit about how to combine colors and create palettes. There's a lot of techniques and little like tricks of the trade used by everybody from like interior designers to, brand marketing people. Color is so essential in communicating things like that. So there's a lot of things like I do with seed beads that kind of without realizing it, that I just sat and thought about for a few minutes, and I wrote it all down and put it in a PDF that you'll get for class. So yeah, we're going to do that. It's like going to be more question and answer, but at the end, we're going to make our own seed bead mix. And the reason I still have this out is I wanted to show these colors. If you were to stir them up in a mix and put a little pepper, meaning sprinkle some opaque black in there, you get this totally different look, but they're the same exact seed beads. So this is another way to stretch your stash. So you take your seed beads that you've used over and over and over, and maybe you've used these colors 1,000 times, make them look completely different just by doing something different with them. That's what we're going to talk about in that color class. And then we're going to do an odd count button cuff with peyote stitch using that mix we made in class. So that's what's submitted so far. And then on my ears, not on the website yet, will be soon. Just have some fun with some macrame. Let's make some macrame earrings. These are going to be really cool. I'm looking forward to that. And last but not least, I just finished, literally hot off the presses this morning, our crystal flowies. So this is going to be the last June class. It's going to be a wrap. Only 2 layers right now. I'm going to put a 3rd layer on there. Check this out. Sparkle. Lots of variations will be possible with this one too. So yeah, that's a lot of stuff all at once, but yeah. And any other questions for me, guys? I'm getting my earrings back on.
Danielle, you answered everything. Again, sidebar was lots of fun today. Lots of our regulars here. I don't know if you have any time to see who's in the class or if their camera's on. I know
social
Pat
media.
had already finished her piece. So thank you again to everybody. And Danielle, the sidebar
I see
just
you
loves
guys.
everything you do.
Oh, Cynthia's holding up her bracelet. She's got it done already. That's so cool. Wow. Oh, Valerie's got hers too. Oh, I love those colors. Valerie did a bright orange color, like a red orange. That's gorgeous. Oh, it's good to see you guys. Well, I want to wish you a great weekend and happy creativity. If you create something from class today, we'd love to see it. If you hashtag John Bead, hashtag Make It With Michaels, we will be able to, reshare it and see it. And also our Facebook group. If you go to blog.johnbead.com, you can join our Facebook group from there. It's the best way to find it. And we post lots of inspiration and work and extras there too. So I hope to see you guys. Have a great weekend. Happy beading.